Well, one of the problems with the whole push to allow children to try and change their sex through preferred pronouns, otherwise known as social transitioning, and then chemicalisation with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, or wrong sex hormones as I call them, and ultimately castration of healthy body parts. The problem is that trans activists have been able to make outlandish claims, and there really hasn't been the evidence for us to push back, so we just get labelled transphobic. Well, those days are well and truly over. The research and the evidence continues to pour in. But we now know the reason that this research wasn't available earlier. They said the quiet part out loud last week. They suppressed research which didn't fit the narrative. So here's the story in the New York Times last week, and credit to the New York Times for even publishing it, although it is behind a paywall now, but wasn't when I accessed it, which is handy. And it's headed US study on puberty blockers goes unpublished because of politics, doctor says. So let's have a read through this article. An influential doctor and advocate of adolescent gender treatments said she had not published a long-awaited study of puberty blocking drugs because of the charged American political environment. I've never heard that argument before when it comes to research. Usually researchers want the brownie points and credibility for publishing relevant material. The doctor, Johanna Olsen-Kennedy, began the study in 2015 as part of a broader multi-million-dollar federal project on transgender youth. They recruited 95 children from across the country, gave them puberty blockers which stave off the permanent physical changes like breasts or a deepening voice that could exacerbate their gender distress, known as dysphoria. The researchers followed the children for 2 years to see if treatments improved their mental health. An older Dutch study had found that puberty blockers improved well-being, results that inspired clinics around the world to regularly prescribe the medications as part of what is now called gender-affirming care. Yeah, that Dutch study is a small study up to 2008. So what's that? That's 16 years ago. It was reported in 2011, and it admitted that puberty blockers didn't pause a treatment. In fact, it predicted the young person going on to wrong sex hormones. Every one of them did. Even back then, the writing was on the wall. But a small study, which set the precedent for the treatment that we've seen, the abuse of children. Puberty blockers were never about giving the children time to think. It was setting them on a destructive path. But remember, trans allies ask parents of transgender identifying young people the shocking question: would you rather have a living son than a dead daughter, or vice versa? It's a mantra that's repeated by media and politicians, including here in New Zealand. They say gender affirmative care saves lives. And basically they say if you don't transition the young person, they will suffer untold mental harm. And if you care for young people, you will comply. So this study was out to prove that mantra right. Next minute. But the American study did not find a similar trend. Dr. Olsen-Kennedy said in a wide-ranging interview, puberty blockers did not lead to mental health improvements, most likely because the children were already doing well when the study began. Well, that's where the bubble bursts. The argument is always that young people have to change their gender, otherwise they're going to suffer mentally and have suicidal tendencies, etc. But now we're being told that actually they're already doing well. So they don't need the treatment then? And if they have the treatment, it doesn't actually improve their mental state anyway. Now you can probably see why they didn't want to publish this study. They're in really good shape when they come in, and they're in really good shape after 2 years, said Dr. Olsen-Kennedy, who runs the country's largest youth gender clinic at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. No conflict of interest there. Their conclusions seem to contradict an earlier description of the group in which Dr. Olsen-Kennedy and her colleagues noted that 1/4 of the adolescents were depressed or suicidal before treatment. Now, this earlier study was weighted heavily towards white young people, so it wasn't diverse in terms of ethnicity, and they failed to account for the fact that many young people struggle with mental health and suicidal ideation through puberty. That doesn't mean you need to change their sex. In the 9 years since the study was funded by the National Institute of Health in the US, and as medical care for the small group of adolescents became a searing issue in American politics, Dr. Olson Kennedy's team has not published the data. Asked why, she said, "The findings might fuel the kind of political attacks that have led to bans of the youth gender treatments in more than 20 states, one of which will soon be considered by the Supreme Court. I do not want our work to be weaponized," she said. "It has to be exactly on point, clear and concise, and that takes time." And then she tries to use funding as an excuse for not publishing the work, even though she'd been given almost $10 million to do the study. And the funding organisation says that her claims, her accusations, don't stack up. But here's where she really exposes her agenda. Dr. Olson Kennedy is one of the country's most vocal advocates of adolescent gender treatments and has served as an expert witness in many legal challenges to state bans. She said she was concerned the study results could be used in court to argue that we shouldn't use blockers because it doesn't impact them, referring to transgender adolescents. Other researchers, however, were alarmed by the idea of delaying results that would have immediate implications for families around the world. Amy Tishelman, a clinical and research psychologist at Boston's College, who was one of the study's original researchers, said, quote, "I understand the fear about it being weaponized, but it's really important to get the science out there." Now, regarding that Dutch study, which reinforced the so-called Dutch protocol of railroading children into puberty blockers, wrong sex hormones, and even castration of healthy body parts, the New York Times article said this: England's youth gender clinic in 2011 tried to replicate the Dutch results, and they did a study with 44 children. But at a conference 5 years later, the British researchers reported that puberty blockers had not changed volunteers' well-being, including rates of self-harm. Those results were not made public until 2020. That's 9 years after puberty blockers had become the standard treatment for children with gender dysphoria in England. Wow. Deliberate suppression of research which goes against the narrative and the agenda of the researchers around the world, not just the US. But champion of puberty blockers and the so-called expert, Dr. Olson Kennedy, outlined her hypothesis of how children would fare after 2 years on puberty blockers, that they would show, this is what she was hoping to find, decreased symptoms of depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, self-injury and suicidality, and increased body esteem and quality of life over time. That hypothesis does not seem to have borne out. They have good mental health on average, Dr. Olson Kennedy said in an interview with the New York Times. Whoops. When asked in follow-up emails to clarify how children could have good initial mental health, when her preliminary findings had showed 1/4 of them struggling, Dr. Olson Kennedy said that in the interview she was referring to data averages and she was still analysing the full data set. AKA, also known as, she was still working with the data to get the result she wanted. Now, the New York Times alluded to the Cass report from the UK, and they said Dr. Hilary Cass, a paediatrician who this year published an extensive review of gender services in England, said that the delays from the American and British research groups had led the public to believe that puberty blockers improved mental health, even though scant evidence backed up that conclusion. Dr. Cass said, "It's really important we get results out there so we understand whether it's helpful or not, and for whom." Her report found weak evidence for puberty blockers and noted some risks, including lags in bone growth and fertility loss in some patients. And in fact, it prompted the National Health Service in England to stop prescribing the drug outside of a new clinical trial, following similar pullbacks in several other European countries. And just back to the New York Times story, An NIH spokesman said that while the agency generally encourages the publication of data supported by its grants, researchers decided how and when to do so. Dr. Olson Kennedy's collaborators have also not yet published data they collected on how puberty blockers affected the adolescent's bone development. But many other papers have been published from the wider National Institute of Health project, including a study last year of older transgender and non-binary adolescents who took estrogen or testosterone to aid their gender transition. After 2 years on hormones, remember, 2 years, the volunteers showed improvements in life and body satisfaction, and patients taking testosterone showed declines in depression of anxiety. 2 of the patients died by suicide, a rate much higher than the general population. Okay, so maybe not so good. So remember, just 2 years of study recruited from 4 gender centres. So they think that these centres can deliver the results. That's why they're getting their treatment. That's why the people are there, because they believe in the treatment. So there's no control group to establish causality. But it's another weak study by activists masquerading as researchers. The New York Times continues, Dr. Olson Kennedy noted that doctors' clinical experience was often undervalued in discussions of research. She has prescribed puberty blockers and hormonal treatments to transgender children and adolescents for 17 years, she said, and has observed how profoundly beneficial they can be. Except she can't prove it. And she suppresses evidence that disproves it. And she's up against it. You see, one of the few rigorous studies which was completed in Sweden followed a transgender group of adults from 1973 to 2003. Yep, 30 years. And this study found this. Persons with transsexualism after sex reassignments, after going through all the process, have considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behaviour and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. Our findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire more psychiatric and somatic care. Restore the natural balance within the body-mind system to resolve physical and mental stress after sex reassignment for this group. In other words, the surgery didn't solve the mental health issues. No surprise. And a more recent study, which I've already told you about, is from the beginning of this year from Finland. Now remember that the mainstream media was silent on this research. Their silence was deafening because they don't want to tell you about these types of studies. It goes against the mainstream narrative. But this Finnish study found that the suicide risk in a large group of adolescents was predicted by the psychiatric problems that often accompany gender distress, not by the gender distress itself. Let me repeat that. The suicide risk in a large group of adolescents was predicted by the psychiatric problems that often accompany gender distress, not by the gender dysphoria itself. And just as the Swedish study had found, the Finnish study said this. Although the rate of suicide in the Finnish study is just over 4 times higher than among trans young people than their peers, this is explained by their more serious psychiatric problems. When these psychiatric problems are taken into account, there is no evidence that transgender people have a high rate of suicide. The researchers say in their British Medical Journal mental health paper, quote, "It is of utmost importance to identify and appropriately treat mental disorders in adolescents experiencing gender dysphoria to prevent suicide. In addition, health policies need to ensure that accurate information is provided to professionals along those lines." Now, they studied more than 2,000 gender-affirmed teens over a 23-year period, and they had a control group, which this one in the New York Times being quoted didn't have. In other words, the main predictor of mortality in this population is psychiatric morbidity, and medical gender reassignment does not have an impact on suicide risk. It doesn't make it better. That's the words of the researchers. Now, the argument which groups wanting to protect children from trans ideology and confusion, chemicalisation and castration have made, I've made it also, lots of groups on our side are making the same argument, is that if you let the child go through the natural process of puberty, rather than interrupt it with puberty blockers, puberty confirms a child's maleness or femaleness, and they grow up and they grow out of the confusion. And there was another landmark study from the Netherlands, who of course started the Dutch protocol of, forcing kids through this puberty blockers cross-sex hormone surgery. It was published in May, and once again, conveniently ignored by the media. But it found that the majority of gender-confused children grow out of that feeling by the time they're fully grown adults. It was researchers in the Netherlands from the University of Groningen, once again tracked 2,700 children. I mean, that is way above the amount that were being followed by in the New York Times study, which, was around 80, wasn't it? 95 children. And this is doing thousands of them over a long period of time. And they followed children from the age of 11 to their mid-20s, and the results showed at the start of the research around 1 in 10 expressed gender non-contentedness to varying degrees, but by age 25 it had dropped from 11% just down to 4%. They grow out of it. And the researchers concluded the results of the current study might help adolescents to realise that it's normal to have some doubts about one's identity and one's gender identity during this age period, and this is also relatively common. And that's basically what the Finnish experts have been saying. Now, look, this is really disturbing for Kiwi parents, because if you follow the research and focus on counselling and affirming a gender's confused child's biological sex, and if you tell them to wait and go through puberty, affirm their biology, under the conversion therapy law, which was passed by most of our parliament a couple of years ago, a parent or a professional or a pastor or a counsellor could be committing a crime and could go to jail for encouraging a child to go through puberty and live their biological sex. That's how disturbing the law is and the debate has become. And studies show that up to 93% of children who begin on puberty blockers will go on to receive cross-sex hormone injections. So puberty blockers don't pause, they predict. And that's contrary to what you'll hear trans activists say. For the sake of our children, we should ignore the conversion therapy law. We should allow children to be children and affirm their biological sex. Now, just before I go, the radical group that pushes this agenda around the world is WPATH, including our own Ministry of Health, Te Whatu Ora, and a group of New Zealand activists called PATHA. And WPATH is considered the leading global authority on gender medicine, but it's now been exposed as the Wild West of Western medicine. And I actually did an expose on them, and you can see that on our website. Just Google exposed harmful trans guidelines. But WPATH have just held a conference in Portugal. We're actually doing an Official Information Act request to see which New Zealanders were funded to go to this conference. And that will be very interesting to see who the government is funding, because we are pretty sure, some inside information, that the government did sponsor some. But here's some of the sessions at this conference that was held last month, despite the worldwide pushback throughout Europe and 22 US states, and of course President Trump's policy, if he becomes president, to ban this abuse of vulnerable children. But here's what WPATH wanted to talk about last month. They want to push on. Let's check out some of them, and I've highlighted in orange some of the interesting words. Mind the gap, improving post-operative dilation care in gender-affirming vaginoplasty. Breaking barriers, using a community-led model to expand access to gender-affirming care. Yep, they're on a roll. P&HJ creates a conceptual framework regarding how anti-transgender legislation and firearm laws shape the suicide disparity amongst transgender and gender-diverse youth in the United States. Wonder if they'll quote the Finnish study for that one. Gender euphoria and identity wholeness in affirming religious spaces. Affirming religious spaces. That'll be religious spaces that have lost sight of scripture. What about this one? Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for transgender and gender-expansive people. Gender-expansive people, that's an interesting term. This is another session they held. Role of gender-affirming hormone therapy on spermatogenesis. Did I say that right? In trans and gender diverse individuals, a retrospective analysis of testicular histological specimens. Another session on satisfaction surveys, sexual satisfaction and function in transgender women. Now that's biological dudes. And gender diverse individuals post vaginoplasty. Dudes and vaginoplasty in the same sentence. That's interesting. Another session, keep calm but do not carry on. Why research should not be conducted. The National Health Services in England are violating fundamental ethics and legal norms. That's a session on basically why they don't like the Cass report. Contemporary surgical update, what's new in vaginoplasty, phalloplasty, non-binary surgeries, penoscrotal hypoplasia after early puberty blockade. Okay, my eyes are just starting to water on that. Let's go on to the next one. Workshop on newborn care for transgender men. So that's basically women giving birth, that pesky biology. Self-reported dilation patterns following penile inversion vaginoplasty. Yeah, penile and vagina in the same sentence. Outcomes of gender-affirming vulvoplasty and vulvaginoplasty among trans feminine young adults with and without pubertal suppression. These are doozies. What a conference. I missed out. Two more. Acoustic and perceptual effects of intonation training in transgender and gender diverse people aiming for a more feminine sounding voice. It's always tough getting rid of the Adam's apple. Actually, speaking of which, the impact of facial gender-affirming surgery on appearance satisfaction and gender dysphoria, a Gender Q and GPSQ study. Whew! They keep pushing on. And now we've found out they keep suppressing the truth. And they manipulate natural childhood with devastating consequences. So we need to keep pushing back. Don't stop for the sake of our children.